Assalamu alaikum, ThinkFest. Good afternoon and good evening from Islamabad. We are joined today by Dr. Tahir Abbas from the Netherlands. I didn't expect to see you all again so soon, but the opportunity to speak with Dr. Abbas came up, and we're going to be discussing radicalization today. इससे पहले हस्ब मामूल मैं आपको बताती चलूं कि आज का सेशन उर्दू में नहीं अंग्रेजी में होगा, और लेकिन अगर आप हमारा सेशन फॉलो करना चाहते हैं और किसी भी मरहले का तर्जुमा चाहते हैं तो मुझे बता दीजिएगा, मैं सेशन के बाद आपको लाजमी तर्जुमा भेज दूंगी। लेकिन प्लीज़ हमारा साथ ना छोड़िएगा और हम सुनते रहिएगा। We have with us Dr. Tahir Abbas today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Saab. Dr. Saab is an associate professor at the Institute of Strategic and Global Affairs at Leiden University in The Hague. And he's basically a sociologist whose research interests include ethnicity, social conflict, Islamophobia, and radicalization. Dr. Saab has also been a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, in London, and a professor of sociology at Faith University in Istanbul, as well as an associate professor of sociology at the University of Birmingham, and a senior research officer at the Home Office in London. That's quite a diverse resume, Dr. Saab. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
No, you're most welcome. I should introduce myself. My name is Azeema Cheema. I am basically a researcher. I specialize in political economy and conflict analysis, but as a researcher, I work with a research firm called Verso Consulting, and we undertake work in a broad set of areas. So speaking with you on the chosen topic today of radicalization, I think it's a very timely topic. So I would like to ask you, how would you frame its significance right now?
The significance of radicalization?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it depends on which perspective we're looking at it from and who the audience is. So if we speak to various government departments in this area, particularly in sort of counterterrorism field, they would see that radicalization is certainly a very big concern. And people like Tony Blair, who gave a lecture at RUSI last week, talks about Islamism being the world's biggest concern today. Somewhat inaccurate, given the fact that the real problems of radicalization in Europe are from the far right. This is also the case in North America. And this is where we're seeing more plots emerging and more plots being thwarted. But radicalization as a concept itself has been bounded about for 20 odd years, and this all began around the time of the War on Terror. And it does mean different things to different audiences, and no two people can agree on what it means. Is it an outcome? Is it a process? Is it linear? Do people dip in and dip out of radicalization? If so, how so? Can we reverse radicalization, i.e. introduce de-radicalization or preventing or countering violent extremism, which are its associates? Again, a great deal of investment in de-radicalization is also going on. But none of this creates much by way of reliable evidence base. Of course, we do have a great deal of research on the question of extremism and terrorism and counterterrorism in policy and practice. But radicalization requires us to think of a much greater set of factors in play when we think about an individual's experience into or out of radicalization. And I think my sort of attempt has been over the last decade and a half is to try and add wider historical, sociological, contextual factors in understanding radicalization. Because for too long, it's been too easy for authorities to paint the picture of ideology as the pull factor, and let's do something with ideology and everything else will be okay. But that's not the case at all. When people end up in radicalization, it's all sorts of structural, historical, personal, psychological factors. Religion and ideology doesn't really have to feature in the picture at all. Now, it does raise the question, am I being an apologist for Islamists? This is the question I get thrown at me all the time. And yes, not everybody who's poor, marginalized, and excluded and alienated feels the need to engage in radicalization as a solution. Of course not. And of course, there are caveats galore here. But yeah, it's a problematic concept, and it has been for quite some time. But I'm trying to find ways of capturing it and better owning it. And the research project I'm currently looking after, is trying to understand radicalization in Northwest Europe, given the context of social exclusion. So we know social exclusion has a role to play. But what does it mean when we have different kinds of extremisms, often in similar parts of the country, even in similar parts of the city, with similar issues around disenfranchisement, exclusion, alienation, the feeling of a lack of hope or opportunity. And this is what's driving far-right extremism as much as it is the idea of Islamist extremism, whether it's in Europe or South Asia, Middle East, etc. It's a lack of opportunity, lots of problems within the life experience of an individual, not because of religion or ideology, but because of everything else often.
Well, I'm glad that you haven't left it to me to point out that you're up against a hostile audience on that point, because going into this session, I thought to raise a question with, a random bunch of people on Twitter and ask about how, what people thought were the driving factors, right? And we come up against this debate where on the one hand, people are actively pointing to structural factors that relate to to economics, politics broadly, while on the other hand you have this firm push to frame it as exclusively a function of culture and ideology, and the chief ideology being religion. So how have you navigated those debates, and how do you think those debates because we're talking about this in the context of the 20-year war on terror. Yeah. How do you think those debates have gone, and have they been constructive or unconstructive? Where have they done good and where have they done damage?
It's interesting. If we go back to the very beginning of 9/11 and the shock that came, and the idea of revenge and going after bin Laden, but of course the Taliban was supposed to give him up. They didn't, so they went and attacked the country. And the ideas that were behind that were also behind the illegal invasion of Iraq. So there's a foreign policy bent that's behind this, which is unequivocal. It's resource grabbing oriented. It doesn't care about the lives of ordinary people. And we've seen this not expressed by sort of overactive researchers, by ambassadors, permanent secretaries, people who have been at the top of ministries who speak openly about how corrupt often politics at the center is. Okay, so where the issue of what to do about it came into play, and in particular when in the UK context, when we had the events of 7/7, so our own sort of mini equivalent to 9/11, I suppose in some ways, the British Muslim communities were very much engaged with the state to try and work through a solution on what's caused this radicalization, what can we do together. And there was a bit of an engagement, and there was a bit of a dialogue that was flowing in both directions, and we were able to make inroads into policy making around thinking through the bigger picture, around thinking through social exclusion factors, around identity issues, belonging issues, historical issues of racism and exclusion that impact on the lives of Muslims across Western Europe still to this day. And so while that discussion was going on, there was an element of openness about it. However, it all sort of became much narrower and narrower as the pressure on the war in Iraq grew. The government, and particularly Blair's government and also Bush, they became a little harder about what they thought the problems were and what to do about it. So if there's been any kind of ideological fundamentalism, it's been on the part of our political leaders. And to name names, George Bush II and also Tony Blair, and this almost messianic approach to how to deal what is seen as a kind of end of times thesis from their own point of view.
Are you referring to perhaps the crusade framing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's too easy to do that. But obviously, I mean, if you speak to the Muslim world, and we do, and this is what they think. If we look at what radicalizers use to draw people into their fold, they use the language of exclusion and the idea that there is a war on Islam, etc. And angry, disenfranchised, deluded, sometimes even young people fall for that. So we try. I mean, so going back earlier, we try to operationalize radicalization in a way that could be nuanced and it has degrees of reliability that could be tested, etc. And we wanted to work with the state to build this set of these understandings. However, it just got narrower and narrower, and then obviously the financial crisis, and then Arab Spring, invasion of Libya, and then the creation and fall of Islamic State. I mean, it's all linked. It's all very circular. We go out doing these foreign policy adventures, and it comes back and hits us back at home. And this goes on and on and on. But our political elites are in complete denial of this, and they continue to be so.
Well, that's interesting. I was just wondering if you see a common thread when you refer to what people talk about when they talk about their personal experiences of being drawn to these narratives of extremism or radicalization, as we would call it. What are some of the common threads? What do people say drew them in? What were their reasons?
The reasons are that the messages, I mean, we can even look at the magazine, The Beak, produced in 26 languages by Islamic State. You can get a version in Dutch, in French, German, and of course English, and so on. What do? They provide local understandings of what's going wrong in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Belgium, in the UK with respect to the Muslim minority experience. They appeal to certain realities that are consistent across these. I mean, if we take radicalization out of the bag, what are we looking at? We're looking at systematic problems of ethnic inequalities, racialization, Islamophobia, exclusion. These things haven't really shifted. And in fact, they've sort of become muddied and almost forgotten about in the language of de-radicalization and extremism. And I think this is what frustrates me the most. And of course, if we look at 4,000 young men, average age 23, went to Islamic State from Western Europe. Places like France, 1,200 went from France, 300 from the Netherlands, about 800 from the UK, average age 23. Their experiences are of third, fourth generation people who've seen downward mobility, who've seen exclusion as the norm, Islamophobia when they switch on the television, read the newspapers. You don't really need much to be radicalized. And what then happens is the radicalizers pick out these particular themes and put it back in the faces of these vulnerable young men and women, and bring them into the fold, because it gives these young men and women a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of groupdom, even in some cases an income. For example, Islamic State, if you ended up there and you could speak French, you could program a MacBook Pro, and you speak English or German, perhaps any other language, you would command more of a salary that was denied elsewhere back in Europe. So plenty of push factors have been in the making for a long time. And then you add foreign policy, and you add hostile environment in terms of public policy, and the media framing of all of this, that's kind of liberal, the illiberal intelligentsia, and how some of that is framed. And policymakers who have taken the eye off the ball when it comes to the citizenry as a whole. It's called cronyism, elitism, and corruption. We just look at the UK in the last 18 months on what's happened during the pandemic, and how all of that has been exposed to its fullest, near enough.
Well, Dr. Saab, I'm not a European, and so please correct me where I'm wrong. But would it be fair to say that in Europe, this space, like for the argument that you're making, it's still quite a contentious space, isn't it?
Not really. In the academy, it's what we understand. It's what we know. It's what our data tells us. It's what our findings. The only contentious areas is kind of racist counterterrorism researchers, racist thinking in various arenas to do with radicalization and de-radicalization, and a very hostile media. In the academy, where we get to do research and get to speak on this, because sometimes when brown people speak up on Islamophobia, we are dismissed because we're brown. We might have a hidden agenda. But when we do get a chance to speak, we can utter quite clearly the facts, and the facts speak for themselves. But we also know that governments cherry pick, and it's possible for academics to be co-opted into delivering government mind.
Of course, but brown people don't always agree, and so I was wondering what you thought of some of the early sort of early risers to this discourse. People like Majid Nawaz, for instance, and the kind of work his organization did. I mean, I suspect that the kind of understanding based on your research that you're talking about is a little bit beyond some of the arguments that were put forward by somebody like Majid Nawaz.
So, of course, I know Majid very well in terms of his public profile and a little bit personally, and the whole setup around the Quilliam Foundation, 2007. In fact, I was asked to speak on a panel with Michael Gove and Liam Byrne and one other individual, the 1-year anniversary of the Quilliam Foundation. So I spoke and I gave a big lecture about, actually it's nothing to do with religion or ideology, it's to do with racism, historical factors, dodgy foreign policy, over-criminalization, dodgy criminal justice system, poor policy making. I literally put cold water all over that, the whole sort of schema. And that video was taken down eventually. Yeah, I mean, I think they were created by the state. They were picked out and handed a bunch of cash and said, you are the ex-radicals, we project you as the solution, off you go. And once the government realized there wasn't really anything decent or coming out of that, they pulled the funding, then they went elsewhere. Some of the sources of that funding was a little bit questionable. And in the end, they just disbanded during the pandemic. And and it's really interesting. I wrote about this in a blog yesterday. It was the British state used this as a way to put a wedge between themselves and the actual needs and wants of ordinary British Muslim communities, to put this organization as some kind of interlocutor around the concept of extremism and de-radicalization. And so we could, or the community out there could throw stones at the Quilliam Foundation and others like it, but it wouldn't render the state untouchable. So it was all perfectly designed. The US did the same thing, took out the formers, wheeled them around, took them to conferences. Here we are, this is what you want to be. This is what we want you to be eventually. And then, of course, these people who have their own psychological issues will sort of flip all of this on its head. But they will still likely to be sort of narcissistic and self-absorbed and attention hungry. And I think we saw that as the Quilliam Foundation unfolded.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because at the end of the day, one of the thoughts that I've been left with, one of the persistent thoughts that I've been left with is how there has been some sort of information apartheid going on with respect to a country like Afghanistan in terms of what perspectives are allowed to come forward and what perspectives are not allowed to come forward, right? And the rationale that plays in my head is that, you know, military occupations have they shape a particular political economy with incentives and disincentives for actors. And so in this conversation, we have gone through this sort of almost bipolar experience with only space for certain narratives and certain stories, creating the kind of exclusion that you're talking about, which has, and this is different from the context that exists in Europe. This is the context that exists here, right? The context of states like Afghanistan, Pakistan, where essentially these military endeavors interface with the local population, and as somebody who is a public opinion researcher, I feel like public opinion is formed over time and is often the results of a lot of the surveys that come across are counterintuitive to Western expectations. And it is difficult to explain those without sort of raising the alarm about radicalization being, the primary driver, and religion being the primary driver, and ideological drivers being at the forefront. So I was just kind of wondering how you see a difference between the context that exists for the drivers that exist for radicalization in the UK versus drivers that exist for radicalization in a country like Pakistan or a country like Afghanistan. And second part of my question is, in which direction do ideas flow? Is radicalization, are extremist narratives flowing to Pakistan from the UK, or is it the other way around?
So I did some work with the British Council about this, looking at radicalization in the MENA region. So it's not quite the same, but there are similarities between what happens in North Africa and what happens perhaps Pakistan. So, we have a very youthful population. Half of the Muslim world is under 25, half of the Muslim world is under 15. Sorry, a third is under 15, half is under 25. So there are these issues in Pakistan and Afghanistan around basic needs, wants, education, opportunity, a sense of a future. And a lot of that has been taken away. I mean, Pakistan has its own problems predating issues of extremism. We have inequality, we have inequitable wealth distribution, we have issues of taxation, and or lack of, and then obviously huge levels of corruption. And those things are going on in Pakistan, in India, and Afghanistan on a daily basis. So you have that in play, and then you have vulnerable youth who have, yes, in fact, Pakistan is very IT savvy, and they're very, very switched on when it comes to those skill sets, which could be seen as a risk for society in some ways as well. But it's a lack of opportunity. It's a lack of clear transparency and accountability and probity, which means that people feel, well, what's the future? Where are we headed? And those feelings and those experiences are going to be even more acutely felt in places like Pakistan and South Asia in general. In the case of, for example, the Tunisians, about 15,000 Tunisians ended up in Islamic State. It wasn't because they were all wannabe jihadis. It was because Tunisia had collapsed after the economy collapsed, after the government collapsed, and unemployment was 40%. They just thought they were going to help their Sunni brothers against Assad. Next thing you know, they get inveigled into something much more deep, problematic. So the push factors are perhaps even more acutely felt, but there are also the range of pull factors there as well. And we know that Pakistan has been sort of throughout the 90s, or throughout the 80s with Zia al-Haq and the opening up of Islamic thinking, and obviously some introduction of Hudud laws, and so yes, that diversity, that sense of kind of the patchwork of language and culture that made Pakistan so rich in the 70s even was disappearing through the Islamization process of the 80s. And then in the 90s, we saw both Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif, I believe, twice prime ministers, twice sacked for corruption back to back, both meddling with the mullahs in order to placate themselves and keep a certain level of distance from the masses. Very, very kind of textbook stuff, really. And it just leaves ordinary Pakistanis behind. It's the ordinary Pakistanis, it's the ordinary Tunisians, it's the ordinary Dutch Moroccans who have very little to go for in life. And with the complexity of foreign policy and the hostile environment on a daily basis, these are enough factors.
Well, if I may, there's a question over time as a researcher in this area that's bothered me, which is the relationship between poverty and radicalization and how that has been treated. And it's sort of gone through this arc of a fairly tenuous set of assumptions being applied that the most poor are the most vulnerable, with realizing that is in fact not the case, right? And then building an argument that was more structured and more nuanced around people who could essentially afford ideology being then the main contributors to the phenomena. But it looks like it's coming back to the argument of poverty as a key driver. And I was just kind of wondering how you felt.
I think you're right. I mean, Sorry, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The issue is that poverty and radicalization have a relationship, but they're not highly correlated. We have plenty of poor people who are not radicalized, and some radicalized people are rich, as it were, educated, certainly, strong-minded, and so on.
I mean, Bin Laden was.
I'm sorry?
Bin Laden certainly was.
Yes. I mean, he's one of the few ideologues, powerful, rich, and smart enough. Now, it's interesting that there have been cycles. So 2000 and maybe up to about 5 or 6, there was a sense that we need to look at the bigger picture. It needs to be much more nuanced. We need to ask much more open-ended questions. But then the war on terror kept on going. Fallujah was happening. Abu Ghraib was happening over in Iraq. So things were rather ugly elsewhere, and it affected thinking at home. But it's interesting right now. This project that I talked about earlier is funded by the European Commission. It's which is just nearly a year into it, of a 3-year project. And the European Commission have understood that there is a need to better understand polarization and ethnic inequalities and social exclusion. I know 3 big grants in the millions which are funded, focused exclusively on those factors in relation to radicalization. And the reason for this is the emergence of the far right. Finally, and sadly, it's allowed state authorities to think, well, it can't always be ideology. There's got to be something else. There must be bigger factors. Mental health might be a factor. Yeah, well, it was always a factor when we think about Islamists and jihadis, but suddenly it's become more of a factor now. So, well, I welcome that as an opportunity to test those ideas out further with would-be Islamists as well. Identity issues, yeah, of course. What's their problem? In the case of French, they're French, they speak French, we treat them equally as French. What problems do they have with identity? Well, the far right have a major problem with identity and identity politics that's creating their mobilization. There's also a sense of a counter-jihad among many far right and the radical right. The radical right are in party politics. UKIP is radical right. EDL is the far right. And then we have Britain First, which is neo-Nazi. So there's a whole spectrum of the far right radicalization sphere that's causing huge problems. And we can't always just pin it on simply ideology, because in part, majority states are responsible for that. The everyday utterances of politicians, Boris Johnson, for example, around letterboxes, around Muslim women. This is emboldening the far right. But they will rather look at social exclusion, poverty, and polarization at that level when it comes to the far right. So I welcome this opportunity. It's come back round a little bit. And it's also, I think, on the back of Trump and Brexit, where we understand political polarization has enough power to swing elections, certainly, and then all of that comes with that. But for sure, I think the pandemic has also revealed the dark, ugly truths. The underbellies of societies have been exposed to this poor infrastructure of British society laid before us, with minorities 4 times more likely to, some minorities up to 4 times more likely to get the virus, and up to 4 times more likely to die as a result of it. And this is not because there's something biological about those folks. It's something about historical factors of exclusion and poverty, disadvantage, racist systems that continue to treat some groups less well than others.
Well, so, the picture you paint, of course, also makes me think of the Black Lives Matters movement in the US, for instance. Yeah. But so bear with me. If I'm sitting in a country like Pakistan and I am noticing a particular phenomena, and I bring this out, this isn't entirely spontaneous. This is a research project that my colleague Johan Chako, who is a PhD student at SOAS, Johan and I started this research project in 2016, so about 5 years ago, where we primarily based our ideas within a theoretical framework that looked at the anxieties of the majority, and we called it the Mass Anxieties Project. Okay. So the idea is that what we noticed is majoritarian identities are convinced by conflict promoters that their power and space is under threat. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at, for instance, Sunni Muslims in Pakistan, you have a rich and fluid environment of Sunni supremacist discourse, which is radicalizing slowly radicalizing people, and with the specific objective to shape the identity of the state. Right? I don't see that as particularly too structurally different from how white supremacy is asserting itself in the US under Trump, for instance, or how anti-immigrant sentiment is being used to assert a European cultural identity in Europe, for instance. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, but that's historically always been the case for Europe. And it's linked to the workings of capitalism. Capitalism needs an other. And Europe has identified that through the colonization. And then obviously the post-colonial dynamic still exists. And we see this sort of framing of the others routinely changing depending on the moment in history and time. And Muslims have been a soft target for a couple of decades. I think preceding that, Islamophobia and radicalization didn't start on 9/11. Already we saw many problems in terms of the Western majority discourse in relation to Muslims, which is just exaggerated and heightened dramatically. And to challenge it has become harder and harder. So I think there's something in that thesis, that there is a kind of majority anxiety, but I think that's whipped up by politicians. I remember in Turkey, where I spent a few years looking at studying the idea of majoritarian nationalism there. I mean, Tayyip Erdogan was very good at whipping up fear of the Kurds and hate of others, of outside forces. And he used that to great effect every time he got into a little bit of a pickle, and he had a few of those. But now, obviously, he's kind of untouchable. He's changed the constitution. He's president, at least till 2023. But there was a time 10 years ago when there were faint observations of democracy still in play. But things have changed dramatically. And I think majoritarian nationalism was a tool in the hands of the political elites, or rather the AKP. And I think a lot of nations are guilty of this. And it's also because of their links with the media, and how media and politics are almost like brother and sister. And I think we have to kind of understand those relations as well. And remember, in many cases, especially America, and more so in the UK, it's basically oligarchic powers that are effectively running policy. Without sounding conspiratorial and sort of grand, sort of crazy theories about who holds power, but we know that oligarchic power very much exists, and huge problems.
How do you think explanations that are situated or framed around culture fit in? So, for instance, we saw we had a very interesting moment today where we have seen, actually we've been watching it over the last few days, where a very aggressive sort of Islamic political identity has been projected by Muslim women in Kabul at universities, for instance. And it's triggered a very hot debate about what is or is not Afghan tradition, or what is or is not culture, where there is continuous framing. It reminds me of how mullahs other genes for women as apparel that is not culturally appropriate. So we had a sort of a similar paradigm today about how the abaya or the burqa or the particular style of burqa that has been adopted by women in Kabul University is not culturally appropriate to the Afghan context. And so how do you feel about those kind of explanations, or that kind of framing that relies on culture as the other?
Well, we know that the Western European powers and North America made a big fuss about going into Afghanistan to save the women and bring democracy. Higher education representation in Afghanistan didn't go up to above 2%, and only ever among the elites in the central areas of the big cities, namely Kabul. The rest was still pretty well the way it was before 9/11, and for many years, because some of Afghanistan is still pretty underdeveloped, tribal, and where there's no real infrastructure. So It's a Western discourse. Let's go out and save the Muslim women, first from the Muslim men and then from Islam itself. It's another one of these colonial tropes that's been around since the West had gone into Muslim lands. Let's save the Muslim women. And so it's muddied the waters in Afghanistan. And I think it's sort of, obviously there's going to be some people there, locals, who were perhaps elites or established in groups and families. And their views may have oriented towards a line on the hijab that probably isn't going to be the same as the Taliban. Although we're looking at Taliban 2.0, although there are no women in the government, and there have been some crackdowns already. So where do we draw the line on culture? I mean, a nation's culture, it's a making of the nation itself. And no, there's no one culture in any one nation. There are numbers of different things going on. It's the idea of culture as defined by those who have power and influence from outside of those cultures. And in the case of Afghanistan, this is what has been happening. And I find it all very kind of really just so difficult to appreciate all of these ideas of what's going to happen to the Muslim women in Afghanistan. How are their futures? It was pretty precarious anyway. We were only talking about the very, very few who got some advantages and privileges. And let's not sort of use that as a stick to beat the people over their heads with, because it was a very marginal affair in a much more complex set of problems in Afghanistan. So I really don't see much value in sometimes framing things as a cultural problem, because who frames, who's being framed, and to what end. And I think that again, it's the Western gaze on Muslim women needing to be rescued, first by Muslim men and then Islam itself.
Well, I approach it in two ways. One is from a point where I recognize that the problem is the patriarchy, and for Afghan women, for a great number of Afghan women, those marginal freedoms or those the progress that was made meant everything. And so for them, they have, of course, had a setback. On the other hand, the cultural framing isn't particularly helpful because it isn't based on a principle of rights, right? And it isn't based on a consistent application of rights. There is a consistent demand to either limit women within the sphere of tradition, or limit women within the sphere of what is culturally appropriate. But we're not taking the conversation further from there. But at the heart of it, we recognize that we are looking at deeply fractured, deeply polarized societies everywhere in this global era of populism.
Yeah.
Right? I think women fighting for their rights in Texas would say the same thing, for instance. And so with the current trends, do you see, because I know that in your blog, you have talked about engagement. Yeah. And that's one of the big questions that I'm left with is really, if we are talking about healing, because there was a lot of talk about healing when Biden was elected. Yeah. If we're talking about healing deeply polarized, fractured societies that have had incentives for one reason or the other, maybe those incentives have been created by the political actors and the political leadership and the competitive political landscape. They've created incentives for people to other each other, to other themselves. How do we now construct an environment for a reconciliation? And I know that in your blog you have talked about engagement. Yeah. So
absolutely,
where do you get going from here, and how?
Well, I think hopefully the pandemic allows us to look at a lot of the issues across the world that challenge us the most with time, patience, that we didn't perhaps do before. And of course, we don't have a climate emergency, and we have a climate catastrophe, and that's also something to very much think about. But on this question of patriarchy, patriarchy again predates. There's plenty of patriarchy in Southern Europe. and vendetta and revenge and things like that when it comes to women and what happens or not. There's patriarchy certainly in South Asia, and so the situation is that we need to have a discussion about patriarchy for sure. Patriarchy behind the Me Too movement, behind Trumpism. I mean, I think it's something that's been challenged. Obviously, we've seen the rise, a certain wave of feminism at the moment that's seen women become much more recognized and accepted and valued and appreciated than they've ever, well, they have been for a very long time, certainly historically. And then I think it's important to have that level of engagement, but it's got to be bottom up, and it's got to be owned by communities, individuals who take part in shaping, bridging these relations, not in some orchestrated, predetermined, state-centric way, which is mechanistic, formulaic, and often highly sort of neo-colonial in some ways as well. So yes, engagement is very important, and that's about giving people the impression that they are being valued and that they are part of a society in which they have a role, in which they can contribute. So we have to kind of work towards building those mechanisms, and they do exist to some extent. It's just, again, all policy initiatives that require some grounded engagement, again, tends to be cherry-picked when it gets up the top of the policy development tree.
And so what I'm hearing is that you're talking about developing real metrics for inclusion that actually have a positive causal effect, right?
Yeah.
And with that, we have, of course, there are many sort of critiques that we can make of the way that the development sector, for instance, or the policy sectors have addressed the problem of violent extremism, particularly in the area of preventing violent extremism or countering violent extremism or de-radicalization programming. What I often find is that those programs don't have a well-defined theory of change for what they're actually trying to do. So if programs are trying, or interventions of any kind, or policy endeavors of any kind are trying to prevent conflict, or they're trying to manage conflict versus them trying to treat conflict, these are three separate scenarios in terms of goals, three separate goals of programs. And a lot of money and energy has been spent without actual clarity on what the goal of that investment is. And with the implementation, we have seen sort of, log frames being reverse engineered to reflect certain outcomes which weren't really part of the design of the project to begin with. So I think that I would recommend very seriously that a proper rethink of what interventions and policy measures are trying to do happen with the goal that they come up with very clear metrics for inclusion.
You see, I think all of that is very true and very fair and reasonable in a world where we would see some degree of flexibility, openness to try and develop these as practitioners and professionals. But too often there is a predetermined outcome of any intervention, and that's poorly designed and thought through, and it's about preventing or countering, and it's placing the idea that somehow these people are about to do something bad. Let's get to them before they do. And I think that whole premise needs to just disappear. Let's see these people, and they're human beings with needs, wants. They're part of societies. Let's allocate resources, is build neighborhoods, communities, regions. Let's build an infrastructure in the way that we might have thought about building societies in the past, but we just don't do that anymore. And it's chasing political cycles, it's short-termist political thinking, and it's really dodgy framing all the way. We have some interesting questions.
Yeah. So I'd like to throw you the question from Ali first. Except Islam, which other religions are being used as instruments of radicalization?
Well, we know what's happening in India, sort of the nationalism that's been based on a kind of Hindutva RSS mentality. We've seen the implications of what that's done for relations with Pakistan, with the issue of Kashmir, and for 250 million plus Muslims in India. We also know that in Israel, we have to be careful here how we talk about this. This is not about Jewish people or Jewish people of the faith of Judaism. It's about particular nationalist ideological perspectives within the current. I mean, certainly under Bibi for a very long time. I mean, at the moment, we haven't seen too much yet from the new regime, but previously it was a very hard line. It was very nationalist. It was racist, effectively. That was, and that's because it was that political intervention. I mean, the Judaism is a big spread of opinion and practice, just as Islam and many other faiths are. But all faiths can be radicalized, even among Muslims. And I think the question there about poverty, and yes, I go on about poverty, but you have more people who are in that sort of pool of available recruits, if you like, the more likely that we'll find many people carrying out acts where the tipping point will be ideology. Now, the tipping point has to be a certain belief on the part of an individual as to why they're doing what they're doing and what benefit would be accrued, etc. So I think, radicalization among religions is possible widely, and Christian fundamentalism is I mean, that's where fundamentalism first came from. It was used to describe Christian fundamentalism groups in the early 1920s, i.e. the Ku Klux Klan was a Christian fundamentalist group.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I'm, at least at an institutional level, if I were to visualize this, I mean, I see a tough road ahead, because at the end of the day, you will always come up to a point where you are trying to reconcile inclusion and sell inclusion to an audience that has some kind of a buy-in to a supremacist argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be a difficult project anyway.
I mean, yeah, it is. And it's not going to happen overnight. And I mean, I'll probably be saying the same thing 20 years from now. We need engagement in bottom-up understandings of problems. I mean, I think that this is inevitable. But there does seem to be a moment as the pandemic begins to kind of lift, and as policymakers have had time to think through where things have gone right or wrong in the past. For certainly in the radicalization field in Europe, we have more spaces to try and move forward our thinking and hopefully our policy development on the back of it. There is this window now. I don't know how long it will stay open, and who knows what's going to happen down the line.
Well, I also want to ask you if the accumulation of grievance that you see among the communities that you study, certainly from where I see communities, the accumulation of grievance is not just state-facing, it's also community-facing. Yeah. But the state-facing grievance certainly has a particular purpose of shaping the state's identity, shaping the state's policies, and it's sort of very well packaged to tap into that, to pressure the state or through interest groups to make certain things happen. And I'm wondering if what trend you see in Europe is all grievance state-facing, and can the state, which would mean that it would be within the state's purview, and the state's, the ball would be in the court of the state.
I mean, it doesn't have to be framed against the state for it to be a state responsibility. These are citizens of the states of various European countries. They have a role and responsibility to act accordingly. We see grievances in a number of different directions. That's why we see radicalizations. We also have, the far right, I talked about, we have incels. And we had a pretty horrific incel terrorist attack in the UK about 3 weeks ago. These are men who hate women just because they're women. And so that's what is that? It's a bunch of young people again. They're online, they're on the forums, they've got grievances, they're angry, they're frustrated, they can't achieve what they want in life, and they found the other, in this case, the women. And it's been in the making for a couple of decades, but it's sort of accelerated quite significantly. What are their grievances? I mean, women surely are not a source of grievance per se, but it's the perceptions that young men have and the sense of their worth relative to women that is creating this. And so there are different things going on. And I think, when it comes to Europe, there are many challenges. My project is looking at Northwest Europe, and we see the challenges of the far right becoming the biggest threat across Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, and the UK. Yes, there are Islamist plots, a lot of plots and groups implicated, and things get thwarted in the background. There have been 2 that have been thwarted in the last 2 months in the UK alone. So it's a combination of things. It's too easy. I mean, I think some of my analysis is kind of old school Marxian. I'm sure it is. I kind of, the state.
I can hear it.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite obvious, but I'm trying to make it more nuanced. But it's really, really about the state has its authority, and therefore a lot of the grievances are aimed at people and structures of authority, and that's why we get the kinds of discourses. But then some of that can also be vented against other marginalized groups. The far right have been sort of drawn in by the rhetoric of the state and their grievances against Muslims and immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers.
So tell me something. What do you think are the most galvanizing events for the far right in Europe, for instance, versus what are the most, over the last 20 years, what do you think has radicalized Muslims the most that has emerged from the war on terror specifically?
Okay, so what's radicalized the far right is the 2 events in the mid-2010s, the rise of Islamic State, but also the refugee crisis that came as a result of that. It's the reason why Angela Merkel has basically been forced out. It's the reason why the German reaction to the refugee crisis just backfired big time, and it has led to some massive problems there going forward, huge problems with the far right all over in former Eastern Germany and elsewhere. For the Muslims, without a doubt, if we think back to the events of 7/7 in July 2005 and look back at the video of Sadiq Khan, what is he saying? He's saying, Tony Blair, you are gassing my people. You are killing my people. I am a soldier, blah, 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 in a war, etc. And it's foreign policy. That guy was integrated. He was a teacher. And I know people talk about that. But 3 out of the 4 of those folks had mental health problems. One of them was 18 years of age. So grievances here, even before 9/11, when we had people who were engaged in foreign fighting during the Bosnian War, even those Brits who went over to training camps in Pakistan, in Azad Kashmir, to take part in the Mujahideen efforts, theirs was a motivation around foreign policy. But in the case of Mujahideen, it's slightly different, of course, because they were the good guys. And the Soviets were still the bad. They were everybody's bad guys in those days. So, the framing of the enemy has changed since the end of the Cold War. The Cold War specialists were morphed into the new American century that became the war on terror and all the subsequent invasions. And I think it's a combination. So when it comes to the Muslims, it's a combination of internal issues, everyday Islamophobia, exclusion, etc., which act as push factors, and the idea that there's something going on in the Muslim world that is at risk because of these foreign policies, and it becomes a kind of duty or a responsibility. And that's when they can be pulled by the ideology to do that, by the ideologues whose line it is to do that. In the 80s, we had ideologues who were sponsored by the Americans. Abdullah Azzam was a Palestinian who was in Afghanistan in the 80s. He was giving lectures in mosques in Brooklyn. And to recruit
this was bin Laden's mentor.
Yeah, exactly. His sort of guru, if you like. And he was also the guy who invented the whole sort of foreign fighter program for Afghanistan. And he was out there recruiting. And foreign fighters move from one ideological battle to the next. They become pretty hardened, and there's no real way back for them. So so it's internal societal problems for the Muslims and external foreign policy problems that leave people thinking, my voice isn't being heard. I can't criticize anything. If I speak out, I'm branded an Islamist. Okay, I'm experiencing Islamophobia and discrimination. Nobody's doing anything about it. Nobody's taking it seriously. Where do I go to get something done? And this is where people then look out for some kind of belonging, some kind of association, and the lines of the ideology that can then start to connect after that. So it's all the push factors that take people all the way to those pull elements. We want to stop the push factors from having any role altogether so that the pull factors become irrelevant. And that's framing. And in terms of the far right, yes, it's the refugee crisis, and I think obviously also the rise and fall of Islamic State. And as the Islamic State was peaking and falling in 2016 and 17, we had all of these attacks. The Westminster attack, the Paris Bataclan, the trial started last week. 130 people died in 2015. The Berlin Christmas market, the numerous attacks over 2 years all over Europe, the Brussels airport attack, which is linked to the Bataclan attack. So that was radicalizing the far right, and of course, social media, the echo chamber effect, these forums. People have very warped understandings of the other because they're so stuck in their echo chamber, and it's so easy. If you're living in a kind of disconnected life, majority, minority, you go online, you can find your own universe that is self-reinforcing, and all of the material that radicalizes people is online. If you think of Tarrant, the Christchurch, his manifesto was built up from content, mostly from US bloggers, well-known US Islamophobic bloggers, and everything else included in that manifesto was public content, the voices, the utterances, politicians, speeches, reports, etc., and Islamophobic content. In Breivik in Norway in 2011 was no different. So they don't have to go very far to get radicalized. Yeah. Go on the internet, switch on the television. There it is.
Well, there's an interesting question from Varun. He says, inequalities have always existed, but people killing others as a reaction is new. Isn't this change driven by ideology then?
Yeah, this is the question I was trying to implicitly answer in my previous long sideways remark. Yeah, you need a bunch of push factors to take people over into the potential for pull factors to take people over into extremism. You limit the push factors, you limit the opportunities for the pull factor to make any impact. Yes, not everybody who's poor, marginalized, excluded turns to violence as a way to deal with their immediate crises. You still need ideology, but if you reduce the pool of available vulnerable people, you reduce the effect of ideology altogether.
Yeah. I think people are noticing an uptick of activity around them, an uptick of activity that is being sort of accelerated, catalyzed by conflict promoters. And people are trying in their own way to make sense of all of this. And I think that that's in essence, where Varun's question comes from, saying, what, these factors have always existed, but we see a lot more action now, and what's driving this action must be ideology. And I think what it is a very competitive and lucrative, proven to be lucrative, proven dividends from an environment of competitive messaging. That political actors undertake, right? There have been dividends in elections, for instance. There have been dividends in increasing space for increasing space and power for groups that do toe a hard line. And because we're seeing that phenomena sort of ripple through most of the world, there is I think at this point an established understanding that there are benefits to be had here to engage in conflict promoting discourse, to engage in othering, to engage in hardline nationalistic narratives that essentially promote one identity over the other. So I think a lot of people are trying to make sense of that. But then again, we have a question from Azeema, who's, talking again to your point about inclusion. Why can't Afghan women be saved from everyone who doesn't give them rights, be they Americans or Afghan men who use one pretext or another? Wouldn't you say this is really about just including Afghan women and letting Afghan women decide for themselves?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that's been long needed, really. And as you said earlier, it's patriarchy is a big problem. And yeah, I mean, this educational infrastructure, poor resources, it's so tribal. And I don't want to use the word backward because that's just loaded. But it's a very simplistic worldview, and it has an effect on gender relations that needs to be moved forward very, very quickly.
Well, the last question's from Amir, who's saying, do you think radicalization programs don't work at all?
Well, you see, if we talk to the Saudi Arabians, they will say that their radicalization program works really well. What they do is they get the ex-radicals, they buy them a house, give them a job, and get them married off, i.e. purpose, identity, belonging, associational life. In one or two cases, it sort of backfired because they carried on even after everything was handed to them. The Aarhus model is about taking the people who come back from Iraq, Syria, and giving them a sense of belonging, training, education, employment, direction, acceptance. And there's some degree of understanding that it is quite successful. When we look at, say, the Prevent model in the UK, that's probably one of the most problematic models anywhere. And yet the British government are always pushing it out to Europe and say, look, we're doing a great job. You should do the same thing. It's deeply problematic. And the very premise of it is racist and neo-colonial. That sometimes you have to stop somebody from becoming Islamist because it's only a question of when. And that is just completely all very, very wrong. Where there is empowerment, where there is a sense of somebody being able to get upskilled and given opportunities, those were seen as development and education. Now they're seen as CVE for some funding mechanism, and that's also frustrating because we not need to call this about terrorism and de-radicalization. We need to think about this as humanity and society and community building, the way we used to do things before the war on terror.
That's actually a very good point to end on, because a lot of these programs, in the de-radicalization programs, in effect, strike me as a little bit of catch and release without any real investment, which would be required to sort of reintegrate people or to build space for people who have been marginalized before, right? You have to reverse that marginalization in some way or other.
Exactly. Rehabilitation, reintegration of foreign fighters, the women and children, reintegration into what? It was the society that caused them to go in the first place. You're going to just chuck them back in? Exactly. Well, it goes on.
Thank you. This has been fascinating.
Thank you.
So we look forward to hearing more from you and also to reading more of your work. Will you be publishing the Medium blog? May we include it under in the comments for?
I'll put a link into the comments. Yes, absolutely.
That would be fantastic. बहुत शुक्रिया. इसके साथ हमारा आज का थिंकफेस्ट अपने इख्तिताम को पहुंचता है. मैं आपको याद कराती चलूं, अगर आपको किसी भी मरहले का तर्जुमा चाहिए तो मुझे बता दीजिएगा, मैं आपको तर्जुमा करके भेज दूंगी. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया डॉक्टर साहब. And hopefully we'll see you back again with another conversation on ThinkFest.
Allah Hafiz. Take care. Allah Hafiz.